So I want to present our next two speakers. We are getting a presentation on an anti-racism toolkit, and we have two presenters from the New Brunswick Multicultural Council. Ivan Okello is a first-generation immigrant from Uganda, East Africa, currently based in the Siknik district of the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, a city also known as Moncton. Ivan currently serves as the project manager of anti-racism initiatives at the New Brunswick Multicultural Council. He is an educator and storyteller who believes in using education as a medium for bridging social inequities and advancing social change. His goal is to live in a society free of injustice. Ivan's educational background includes gender studies, international development, and anti-racism decolonization. He has previously worked in post-secondary institutions and nonprofits. Ivan is passionate about building bridges across diverse communities and ensuring that society and organizations are redesigned to serve and cultivate everyone's potential. Additionally, with Ivan today, we have Sarah Djora Kheddache. Sarah is an Amazigh woman of Algerian nationality, holder of a bachelor's degree in ecology and environment and a second one in sustainable development and coastal zone. She has a wide range of interests. She has, among other things, worked as a journalist, columnist, and project manager. Engaged wherever she goes, Sarah is involved with several organizations. Sarah is the event coordinator for Represent New Brunswick and project and digital marketing manager for the New Brunswick Multicultural Council. So I want to thank and welcome Ivan and Sarah both to our session, and I'll hand the mic over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nicole, for the introduction. We're really delighted by the opportunity to join the Respectful Workplace Week, this year, and we know that so much work has gone into putting this together. And I just want to thank the organizers for inviting us as NBMC to participate in this session. And I just wanted to begin by saying that my intention this morning is to share, in this conversation for about 50 minutes. So again, just to let you know that my intention would be to go over some of the material in about 30 to 35 minutes, after which from 30 to 35 minutes, I'll just add my volume a little bit. And yeah, and probably have a Q&A by the end. And that way, at least we're able to have a great discussion. And just to let you know that I have been working with NBMC for a little over a year and a half, and in that time span, NBMC's portfolio around anti-racism work has grown so much, and that is because there's been a growing interest from different employers, but also there's been a growing, incoming migration into the province. So we've been having a range of requests coming from government institutions, nonprofits, the business community, to make sure that we can create resources that are more responsive to these needs in the community. Now, I just want to preface by mentioning that I have my neighbor doing some construction work. So if you hear any background noise as we do this presentation, that's just my neighbor doing some of his work. And it's one of the, I guess, the experiences that come with working from home, where if your neighbor is having a party, then you get to be part of that party as well. But we won't be, hopefully, it won't get too much of a convenience, but in the end, if you have any challenges, just do let me know. So for now, go on.
I was just going to say, so far, so good. No construction noises, but thanks for the heads up.
Oh, that's good. Because I just wanted to preface, because I was like, you might hear like someone is installing a new roof. And I'm like, nope, it's not happening at my property. But just so you know that it's all good. There's no, unsafe situation going on around. So what I'm going to do right now is to share my screen. And what I want to really go over is a little bit about who we are as NBMC and the work that we do, but more importantly, why we do it and why we are seeing this growing interest in anti-racism work, and how we interact with different institutions and agencies, but also, and in the end, give you an opportunity of really identifying some insights on how you could be involved in this work, because again, this is a growing area of interest, not just within NBMC, but among the organizations that reach out to us. And it's largely influenced by several factors, whether it is immigration or there is, a very high, retention or recruitment within organizations that are having very new demographic, like dynamics in their own organizations. And as a result, it's presenting new realities which justify the need for these conversations. So we'll go over this for a little bit, about 25, 30 minutes, and I'll open the floor to questions. But in the end, if you do have any comments, feel free to use the chat, because I would like to get as much of your engagement and participation as possible. So I'm going to share my screen and make sure that everything is working fine. I know technology is always an interesting friend, because, on some days it can work real well, and on some it can be a little bit of a challenge. So we'll just make sure that we do that, and we should be good. Okay. And I think we should be good. All right. So I'm just going to begin by introducing myself. My name is Ivan Okello, as Nicole mentioned, and I have the privilege of working with Sarah, and we've been running this project for a little over a year and a half now. And this work has grown really very much from NBMC's, intention to expand this body of work over the last couple of years. And for many of you, you may have recalled the survey that NBMC, conducted in 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests. And with that time, there's been a growing interest in this work, both with the commissioners, report last year, but also within different organizations, really taking a lot of ownership and initiative to make sure that the organizations are either anti-racist or inclusive, and adopting all the norms that make an organization a strong actor in retention, but also in building inclusive community. So I'm going to begin by sharing a little bit about NBMC. So many of you may not know, NBMC has been existing in New Brunswick for about 40 years now. And we had our 40th anniversary in the spring when, we had a celebration in Fredericton. And it tells you how, we've grown as an organization, not just in terms of the organizations we represent, but more importantly, in terms of the issues that NBMC, advocates for with the province. And during that timeline, we've been able to work really, really closely with different levels of government in areas of diversity and immigration and multiculturalism and settlement. And as you can tell, so much has changed in the last, 40 years with that work, because 40 years ago, immigration wasn't as a strong, aspect of the provincial, population growth strategy as it is now. And because of that, there's been a growing interest and opportunities for partnership. But also lastly, NBMC has worked with different agencies in terms of mobilizing resources. Now, many of you may know about, for instance, the Afghan refugees or the Syrian refugees, or, like the Ukrainian community that was coming to New Brunswick in the last year and a half. And NBMC was playing a critical role with different actors, whether it is in government, but also, with settlement organizations, to create a structure and a process to make sure that we settle those communities in New Brunswick as quickly as possible, and we give them the resources for them to do the work that they can, they can to make sure that these communities have a good head start and can succeed in the province. Now, in the end, we don't work alone, and that's something we like to emphasize, because across the province, there's different organizations that might be closer to your location that we work with. If you live in southern New Brunswick, you might know about Magma in Moncton, or...
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Ivan. I just wanted to let you know, we are not seeing you moving your slides. We're just seeing your original PowerPoint page.
Oh.
So maybe...
Yeah, let me...
Yeah, I just didn't want you to keep going without realizing.
Yeah, that's a good... I'm glad you pointed that out. Let's see. I'll just try and redo this. Make sure that the presentation is frozen. It shouldn't be.
We're seeing your Our Members page now. There, if you wanted to hit from the beginning, and we'll see if it's moving.
Is it?
Well, it kind of moved, but then it swept right back to where we were.
Oh.
Do you want to try unsharing and resharing?
Yes. Let me try and do that. just to make sure.
And if that doesn't work too, I can try controlling your screen and seeing if I can fix it.
Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing and make sure that we can just do this. Let me try and reshare again, and just let me know if you're able to see it.
Will do.
Okay. So
Perfect.
voila. Looks like this is good.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so my apologies about that. I thought this should have been working fine, but thanks, Nicole, for pointing it out. So as I was mentioning, that all this work that we've done so far, we don't do it alone. We have different stakeholders that we've worked with. So if you live in the southern part of New Brunswick, there's Magma, for instance, in the Moncton area. There's the Newcomer Center in St. John's. There's MCAF in Fredericton. And this just shows you the different actors that do this work on the ground and serve newcomers and make sure that they have a quick and simple integration into the community. And this has really been a product of partnership. And this is because, as many of you know, New Brunswick is a geographically large province. And because of the vast distance between communities, that it really, really helps to work with different stakeholders in those regions. And this is really how NBMC has been able to do this work successfully for 40 years in advocating for immigration and integration of newcomers, but also being able to foster relationships in different communities up until this day. Now, going back to 3 years ago, like NBMC's work really began with being able to really examine some of the sentiments within New Brunswick in terms of inclusion. And one of the things that came out of that was the survey that we conducted in 2020. And the intention of the survey was to really get a sense of what do New Brunswickers think of inclusion, but also what have been the experiences around, issues of, discrimination or systemic racism. And one of the things that came out of that survey was that as many as 95% of the people that completed that survey indicated that, racism does exist in the province. Now, one of the things that was particularly eye-opening for NBMC was knowing the domains or, the sectors within which, those forms of discrimination are identified. And, Medicare was one of them, and education and employment and housing. And you could really tell that in many instances, those were the first primary spheres of interaction for newcomer communities. And whether it was accessing housing, upon arrival, or education for themselves, or their children, or employment. And the thing that really was eye-opening at the end was that there was such a negative implication of that, of that lack of inclusion that was actually leading to loss of economic opportunities, but also a subsequent out-migration out of the province. And I think it was the first time that we actually had a body of work that had looked into this subject and looked at the different elements that might, constrict different organizations, but also limit newcomers from actually fully participating in the life of the communities in the province of New Brunswick, and seeing that sometimes that led to the out-migration outside of the province. And because this finding became really, really clear, from that survey, NBMC went ahead and started engaging with different actors in different, sectors to really identify ways of, building this body of work, but also creating a response strategy that would be able to address these sorts of incidences, going forward. And one of the key insights that also came out of that survey was that there was a strong lack of diversity within the leadership, in different levels of governance in the province, but also that in itself, actually made it a little bit challenging to build an inclusive province. And one of the key recommendations was that a leadership program be developed that really focuses on mentoring and providing opportunities for people from, BIPOC or immigrant or racialized backgrounds to be able to engage in leadership, but also to be able to access, like mobility within their own, like employment spaces. And one of the things that came out of that was actually a program that NBMC currently runs called Represent New Brunswick. And the idea of the Represent New Brunswick program is to really equip newcomers to the province with skills and knowledge and professional connections to be actively involved in the communities by giving them, an understanding of the governance fundamentals in different organizations, but also the opportunities to participate in different organizations as this work goes forward. And so far, we've been really, really pleased to see the level of engagement and interest in this program. We have run a complete cohort last year, and we're doing two concurrent cohorts, this year, and that's something that we'll be more than happy to share with you as we go along. And because of this background of information, NBMC was able to identify the way that it wants to take on this work going forward. And one of the things that we decided to do within NBMC was to embrace a three-pronged approach that would be addressing incidences of discrimination within the province. And the primary one is the one that I already hinted on, where we'd be looking to equip newcomers or racialized people in the province with skills and tools, because we felt like building diversity within the province relied on us equipping a new generation of leaders that are able to become, change agents, but also active participants within the communities. But the second, option for us was actually to build capacity within organizations. And one of the things that we learned over the last year and a half is that many organizations lack capacity, internally to be able to have trainings, to be able to build resources, and sometimes to be able to have staff that actually, designated to do inclusive work within different organizations. And the last one was to really promote education with different stakeholders, and whether that be post-secondary institutions, multicultural agencies, the business community, and so forth. So thus far, NBMC's work has really been building our portfolio of work around these three approaches, knowing that they do not work in on their own, but in tandem they have such a collective and powerful approach to creating an inclusive province within New Brunswick. Now, with that, one of the things that we did was to create an anti-racism toolkit, which I'm going to be exploring a little bit in detail today. So, and again, this is really meant to give you, an exploration of key themes and concepts that come up. And again, if you're curious about the toolkit that we provide or the anti-racism training that we provide, we will be happy to follow up with you, after this session. But it was really to give you an idea of what are some of the themes. And one of the things we did in developing this work was to build the anti-racism training and the anti-racism toolkit to go in tandem. So basically, we often provide training to organizations, and then we provide them with a toolkit as a living document that they can always go back to and explore within their teams or within their staff, but also to give a sense of roadmap for organizations to take in creating an inclusive culture within their own organizations. And this is because in many, many instances, there was a lack of resources or a lack of expertise, either internally, or there was also a limited amount of external experts that could do this work. So I'm going to go through just a number of themes, and some of them do come up in detail in the training, and some of them come up in detail in the toolkit. And we try to really re-emphasize both aspects of the training and the toolkit to make sure that if the themes that could be explored a little bit in detail, you can do that in teams, you can do that within like a number of employees within your organization, but also it becomes kind of this exploratory exercise for an organization to determine its inclusive position right now, whether it is aspirational, or it's in terms of its own priorities, or it's in terms of its own small actions. And because we knew that many organizations start from a very different place, we wanted to create something that has a different element that works for different organizations. So these are some of the themes that we do explore in the toolkit. One of them explores the history of Turtle Island, and that really goes into the history with Indigenous communities, reconciliation and so forth. The next theme really explores incidences of racism and discrimination, and that really collects past and present cases of discrimination within public policy, but also within organizational structuring that have been historically damaging. And the third is really explores concepts of privilege and intersectionality. And the last one is more the practical response strategies to different forms of, discrimination. So we're just going to go through some of those themes in a little bit more detail. And if you have any questions or comments, you can, share them with us in the chat and so forth. But this is really meant to just give you the scope of what the toolkit covers. And it's also to mention that the toolkit was built as a starting document that could also evolve and could become, added on by other resources. So again, it's not the beginning and, the end or the one and all, but it's really meant to be a starting place that organizations can build from, to create an inclusive culture within the organizations. So one of the first themes is really being able to explore how to use the toolkit. And we felt like that was a good place to begin, because typically creating a toolkit comes with being able to actually articulate how it could create the most value for the organization. And the first thing that we did was to introduce some key terms, explore, how to use the toolkit, especially in different organizational dynamics, but also to explore theoretical frameworks. Now, one thing you'll notice is that a lot of anti-racism work often sometimes lacks a theoretical backing. And one of the things we wanted to explore in the toolkit was to give suggestions on different theoretical frameworks that organizations can use to inform, the anti-racist response, because we felt like if an organization creates a workplace harassment policy or an anti-racist, or anti-racism policy in the workplace, more often than not, it lacks its own positioning in theory to say, why are we doing this work? And what is the roadmap that we're looking to explore? And perhaps how do we know that we've hit the mark? Or perhaps how do we find out that we've missed the mark? And that's something that we wanted to be able to, address. And we did that through the theories. So again, that was meant to really give you an idea of what are the key themes. But it's also important to note that this is an ever-changing field. So there's often new information, there's new ideas, sometimes there's new terminology. So again, you could find, that some of the, the key terms in the grocery, in the grocery list have changed in the last month, or perhaps in the last year or two. So again, it's to really give you more like a starting place, and then you can build on. And one of the benefits, from the toolkit was that it has a list of external resources you could access. Most of it is actually live links. So some of them you just click, whether it's a TED Talk or it's, like another, presentation, a Harvard Business Review, like article. And most of that was actually meant to refer you to external resources. So you get not just a living document in itself, but also, a connection to all external resources that you could explore and use based on the need of the organization. And the second piece was really addressing, the topic of, truth and reconciliation. Now we know that this is really, really a challenging one, because again, depending on your locality and, the nearest, First Nation or Indigenous community close to you, we wanted to really create a level of building a relationship. Because one thing we find is that because New Brunswick is so big, it's hard for an organization based in St. John to have connections to an Indigenous community in the Miramichi area. And one of the things we wanted to encourage is building relationships with Indigenous communities close to the locality of your business or of your organization. And that's something that we try to explore. And and we had some guiding questions to explore if there's any attempts to build that type of relationship, but also any kind of reconciliatory path that the organization is trying to take. The second piece was around land acknowledgements. And we know that, again, in New Brunswick right now, that is something that comes with a lot of tension, and it's also somewhat of a divisive topic. But one thing we wanted to emphasize was the importance of land acknowledgements, but also the importance of solidarity and building solidarity with Indigenous communities. And the toolkit explores some of those themes and provides, whether it's examples or external links or just activities that one can do, or a journaling exercise that really explores individual attitudes or any preconceived ideas or biases that one might have, about those communities, and how they can identify and find means of checking those biases. The other piece that the toolkit goes into is to really look at the historical context of forms of discrimination within Canada and New Brunswick. Now, we find that, again, this is something that is well covered within the training, and the toolkit just expands a little bit beyond where the training covers. But it's also meant to give you really the scope of changing public policy within Canada in terms of immigration, for example. And I think immigration is a good example of that. Now and 50 years ago and 100 years ago, the public policy and the perception of communities towards immigration has shifted so drastically with changing global events. And we wanted to really be able to show that, right now, we really have a good, reception of immigration at the moment, but it wasn't really very much the case, 30, 50 or 80 years ago. And because of those changing, times, some of it has been influenced by government positioning, some of it has been influenced by global events happening in different parts of the world. But we wanted to show how it perpetuates, these negative outcomes, and, and how it impacts specific communities drastically more than the others. And the other piece is it addresses the concept of whiteness within anti-racism work. And this is something that, again, sometimes might be a challenging topic to explore, but also I find it's something that is actually worthwhile for any organization that is looking to build an inclusive path within its own, internal structures. And lastly, it goes into mental health impacts of really different forms of discrimination on racialized communities. And I think the main thing, again, to emphasize in this section is how it impacts a sense of belonging in the workplace, how it impacts performance among, racialized or immigrant staff. And now, especially when we're having more and more, diversity within our workforce, this becomes something of a key consideration or something to anticipate, some level of response internally to addressing this work. Now, we have two other models, and, and those models really, again, explore really different things. The other one really looks at, the manifestations of racism in the work environment. And I think this is really one that is very much connected to the present, where you see that there's a growing diversity within, the communities that come to the workplace, but also there's a growing, tensions that come with, for instance, having external, social events, whether it is, Black Lives Matter or Indigenous, resistance in different communities, and how that affects the sense of place within the workplace. And it also goes into to explore a little bit about the aspects of intersectionality. And we know that this is something that has become a growing area of interest because of the growing diversity, again, within the workplace. And then it goes into really the negative implications of the persistence of these forms of discrimination in the workplace. And it could be microaggressions or gaslighting or tokenism. And the reason why those are highlighted is that it affects participation, it affects one's sense of inclusion in the workplace, but also it affects performance. And generally, those two or three elements actually work hand in hand, sometimes to limit participation for different communities. And the last one really goes into identifying some of the ways that we can address, different forms of discrimination in the province. And one of the things that we really identified was the role of leadership, in creating an anti-racist organization. And one of the things that NBMC is actively doing is to engage with different actors, whether it is in municipal government or in provincial government, or sometimes decision-making organizations like agencies, boards, and commissions, to really find mediums of expanding the pool of talent that accesses leadership, but also exploring pathways of creating different forms of diversity within those spaces, whether it is, diversity of thought or it's of expression and other, examples. And it also goes on to explore, for instance, the aspects of accountability. Now we know that, again, data tracking has become one of the really strong elements that we explore in this work. We've had organizations say, we want to be an inclusive organization, but it's not clear what that looks like. And I think sometimes the challenge is where there's no target, there's no outcome. And I find that this is generally very true also in anti-racism work, because when an organization says we want a gender diversity by 2025, then the question becomes, what is your gender diversity now? And how do you track that data? Or how do you use, the other metrics to make sure that you collect the right data to actually track your progress as you build to become an inclusive organization? Now, the last element really explores the concept of solidarity and allyship and championing. And again, these are interchanging words and many of them will come. But one thing I want to emphasize is that generally in the context of organizations, a lot of these policies would be probably and should be built with the internal frameworks and dynamics in mind, because I think sometimes it's challenging to see an organization have this very public participation in all the different social events without actually having a coherent and sustained policy internally that addresses these incidences. And I think we saw some of that come out in the last 2 or 3 years, where you see an organization putting a statement saying, it discourages all forms of discrimination, while the staff in that organization mentioned that, like, oh, I've never seen this organization challenge any form of discrimination internally. Or maybe there's a lack of policy to address those incidences when they come up. So you can almost see a lack of coherence between the public messaging and the internal, processes that are meant to bring about, these outcomes. Now, the last one that we really explore, but somewhat in a small scale, is care or radical self-care. And this is something that has become really, really more and more pronounced because of not only the harms of discrimination on those communities that are impacted by it, but also sometimes the challenge that comes with doing anti-racism work or anti-oppressive work on the people that do that work. And I think, Manju, for instance, is a good example of how, doing that work sometimes comes with its own emotional burden, and how one can, maintain a level of restorative care or being able to build like a restorative community that they are able to kind of find ways of. And I think, many new communities are starting to explore what radical self-care looks like in the workplace, to say, do you need to, have, like a sustained community group within the workplace to create that level of safety and communal participation. And it varies depending on context, but it's something that we try to address in the toolkit because it's something that has become more and more urgent in terms of response. And the other one is grounding exercises. Now, again, we know that sometimes these conversations can bring different emotions depending on who is leading the conversation or depending on who has been, impacted in the past. And we know that between, the triggers and some of the, the reflections that come, that different emotions might come up. So we want to make sure that there is, a context of how to navigate those feelings, when they do come up. And lastly, to really emphasize, care around racial trauma. Now, this is again something that, for instance, we have, like counselors that have an expertise or specialization on racial trauma, and many of them are really exploring this work and talking to organizations of, how do you support staff that might have, traumatic events in their lives when they're going through something like we did 2 years ago with, the death of George Floyd, and the emotions that come with such an event on your teams. And I think many organizations are starting to embrace this conversation of saying, how do I support, my racialized staff if they're dealing with, like, police brutality, or how do I support immigrant staff if they're dealing with, disputes in their home countries, or they're dealing with just the, like the separation of culture or the lack of social capital in a new culture. And I think that has been really, really encouraging because it shows you that there's a growing interest to create the right conditions for these communities to thrive within the workplace. Now, you might ask and say, how does this work continue to grow, or how do we continue to build this work going forward? NBMC builds a training and also built a toolkit, and that's one of the things that we want you to be able to, to request if you want training for your organization or you want resources to share. And one of the things you also did was to be able to identify funding partnerships. And right now we actually have a number of organizations that have reached out to us saying, we are looking for resources. Can you help us build resources? Or we have funding to do some bits of work around inclusion. What do we need to do, or how can we support? And we're working with a few municipalities right now to expand on those partnerships. We also have delegates from our Represent NB program, and many of them either have been placed in boards or decision-making organizations, and some of them are still looking to be placed in boards. And one of the things that we're always looking out for is opportunities to build partnerships and build opportunities for collaboration, for these specific groups. And so far we've been really, really happy with the feedback that we got. And the last one is really exploring partnerships. And we've had, again, different organizations reach out to us and say, we do not have capacity in this. Do you know an organization that might help us with this? And because we are a provincial organization, we are like, you know what, we have this organization in St. John that is doing excellent work. Why don't you connect with them and identify some of the ways you could be able to do this work? So yeah, so these are some of the ways you could be involved with this work, and it depends really on what are your immediate needs, but also we are more than happy to explore any common interests and potential collaborations. So with that, I don't know, do we have any questions? I know I tried to run through this and save some time for us to be able to have a bit of a discussion, after, but, do you have any questions, any comments?
Thank you so much, Ivan, for the presentation. The toolkit sounds really exciting. I know I often see instances where I may be doing a harassment investigation, or I may be intervening and doing a mediation in a workplace, and that workplace is then looking for resources on how to address situations that might have been grounded in unconscious bias or systemic racism,